So at the end of last year, I made a video on basic NPC interactions in GameMaker and how you can do things like walk up to an NPC, hit a button, and start talking to them and show some text on the screen like this. And I got a couple of follow-up questions on that video that went to the effect of how you can do things like customizing the shape, size, look, and feel of these text boxes. And that actually confused me a little bit, because when you're a veteran GameMaker user, this is the sort of thing that you do just without thinking about it. But if you've never thought about this before, for the same reason, this can actually be a really good way to start transitioning from thinking about code as just a magic system that does magic things for some reason, to thinking about code as a series of instructions that are carried out directly and that you are in control of. So today we're going to talk about how you can do things like changing the size of the text box, or changing colors, or changing fonts, that kind of thing. If this is something you've never thought about before, I want you to think about why the things that we do in this video are going to work, and how you can apply this to other things in your game. So if you haven't seen that original NPCs video, I would recommend going and watching that, obviously, so that you know what the things in this code are going to be doing and how they got there. I will have links to that original video in the description and also probably popping out of the screen. Pretty much all of the code that we're going to mess with is going to be in the player's draw GUI event here, because that's where the actual text box is drawn on the screen. If you have your game architected in some other way, and if you have some sort of like persistent game manager object, this will likely be in there. Wherever you put the code that actually draws the box and draws the text, that's what we're going to be looking at here. So it does bear mentioning that sometimes in computer science it can be rather difficult to tell the difference between tasks that can be done in just a couple lines of code and tasks that are actually a lot more complicated. And indeed, there's going to be a couple things that we do in this video that are really simple and can be done in just a couple lines of code, and there are going to be some things that I'm going to acknowledge but not go into that are actually a lot more complicated. So let's start out with something easy. How can you go about changing the size and shape of this text box? So the first 4 lines, well, the second through 5th lines, I guess, in this draw GUI event over here, this is where the corners of the text box on the screen are defined. And x1, y1, x2, and y2, those are passed into the draw rectangle function, and that is the coordinates on screen where this rectangle behind the text is drawn. If you wanted to go and change the location of the text box on screen, you can go and change the coordinates. So right now, x1, y1, the upper left corner of the text box is going to be on the left side of the screen, 160 pixels from the bottom, like this. And if you wanted to change this about, if we wanted to add, for example, some padding between the edges of the rectangle and the left and right sides of the screen, we could say x1 is going to equal, say, 32, and x2 is going to equal window get width minus 32, and that is going to give us, when we run the game, a rectangle that is drawn at the bottom of the screen still, but there is now some distance between the left side of the rectangle, the left side of the screen, and the right side of the rectangle, the right side of the screen. Okay? And if you wanted to take this a little bit further, if you wanted to make this maybe float a little bit above the bottom of the screen, we can say, for example, y1 equals window get height minus 160, y2 equals window get height minus 32, and this will cause a little bit of space to be created between the bottom of the screen and the bottom of the rectangle like this. Great. Also, the location where the text is drawn, that is going to be, in this code, that is relative to the upper left corner of the rectangle, just at all times. So if you move the rectangle around, the position of the text should automatically move with it. You don't have to do this, strictly speaking, but it would be really inconvenient if this wasn't the case, and if when you move the text box around, you also had to change the position of the text itself to make it, not falling out of the box. We're just going to leave it like this because it makes our life easier. So the text box right now is still at the bottom of the screen. We could, if we wanted to, do things like move it to the top of the screen. And if I wanted to do that, we could say y1 equals 0, y2 equals 160. And this is going to put the text box at the top of the screen instead of the bottom. You'll note that it is still perfectly aligned with the top of the screen. There is no space between the top of the screen and the text box. And of course, if you wanted that, you could set y1 equal to 32. You could do whatever you want. You could have the text box aligned on the left or right side of the screen. I don't really know why you would, because then it would be awkward and squishy and vertical. It's your game. You can do whatever you want. So there is another related question that people have asked about this, which is how you can make a text box float above the head of a character and stay there when the player walks around or the character walks around. And that is going to be one of those things that I just don't get into here. So there's actually a bunch of ways of doing this, all of which have their own trade-offs. And only one of them is really what you might call, like, complicated. And even then, it's the sort of thing that you just use someone else's code for. You probably aren't going to be writing yourself. But they all touch on a couple different aspects of GameMaker, which you probably haven't encountered yet. And I would want to take the time to sit down and explain all of them properly. And I don't want this video to go on forever. I want this to be a relatively quick video of things that you can do to make a dialog box more interesting. So the next order of business in customizing this text box is how can you do things like change the color of the text, the color of the font, the typeface that the text is drawn with. So this is nominally all pretty easy. So when you say draw set color, you're just literally drawing the setting the color that whatever comes next is going to be drawn with. In the case of this rectangle, it's going to be C_white. In the case of this draw text line, it's going to be C_black. So we have black text on a white background. If we wanted to switch those around, we could just do that. And we are now going to have white text on a black background instead of the other way around. Great. I haven't actually set a font in this example, but you can also create a font in GameMaker, and you can set it in very much the same way. So FNT_default, I think I'm going to call it. We are not going to be using Arial, because Arial is objectively the worst font I have ever seen. I know that it's popular to dunk on Comic Sans, but honestly, like, at least Comic Sans looks like something. Arial just looks like... So, like, on my desk in front of me, I have a letter from, like, the IRS about taxes and stuff, and, like, the IRS isn't even using Arial on their official communications paperwork. Like, Arial is too boring for the IRS. Let that sink in for a minute. So, because we appreciate Comic Sans around this YouTube channel, I think I'm just going to go and use that. Where is it? Here it is. And we can make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to make this, I think, 16. And that should be big enough to see. We can say draw set font, FNT default. And if I use this font when we're drawing our text, if I set this before we draw our text, this is going to have these NPCs speak in Comic Sans. All right, that's a fun time. So I don't think this is actually what people are asking when they ask me how you can change the font in the dialogue system like this. I think what people are really asking is how you can have different characters speak in different fonts. Almost like having an accent or something. It's an interesting way of characterizing characters in a video game. The most popular example is, of course, Undertale has a couple of characters who famously speak in a different typeface from the rest of the game. Other games, Earthbound, which Undertale derives a lot of inspiration from, also has characters that speak in a different font from everybody else in the game. And let me go and create a new font. We can call this FNT alternate. I'm going to have to pick a different font this time. Which one do I want to use? I want it to be sufficiently different from Comic Sans, so it's not going to be one of the other, like, handwriting fonts I have installed. Let's go with a Pixel font. So I think where is it? PixelLocale is the default dialogue font that we use in WizardX. Let me set that to a size of 16 as well. Make it a little bigger. PixelLocale is not one of the default fonts installed on Windows. I will have a link to where you can find it if you're interested in using such a font on your own. So how can we have different characters speak in different fonts? So in the same way that each character has their own array of text, lines of text that are drawn when they speak, we could also go into the character's create event, and in addition to defining a variable which is going to store an array of text, we can define a variable which is going to store a font which we can use. And I'm just going to make this a single variable. I'm not going to make this an array for every single line of text. That's going to be a little bit much. But if I were to give the NPC object in its create event a text font that it will use, we can do something here which is not unlike when the player talks to an NPC and fetches the line of text that they have to say and puts that on the screen. We can do basically the same thing with text_font here. So in my player object, we have a couple of variables which are defined for the currently active NPC dialogue. So the same way that I have a variable that's like current text, we can say current font, and we can assign this a default. -1 is a fine default. That's the GameMaker default font. We could also actually define it one of ours, like FNT_default or something like that. And we can have, when the player walks up to an NPC and talks to them, over here at the bottom of the step event, where we hit the space bar. This is where we're going to assign the text, and a little farther down, when you hit the space bar again, this is where we're going to like grab the next line of text if we're not at the end of the array. And we can say something like current font equals who is here dot text underscore font. And again, this is a single variable. This is not an array. You could make it an array if you want, but I think that would be going a little far. And going back over to the draw GUI event, where we actually put all this on the screen, we could say draw set font current font, and that will allow us to assign fonts per NPC. So this guy here is still talking in Kamex Sans. If I were to go into the room over here where we've defined all of these guys' text in creation code, let's say this NPC down at the bottom who's talking about farting, you can talk in the PixelLocale accent, if that's the metaphor we want to use. And when I run the game now, if I talk to you, Kamex Sans, and if I walk down here, I think it was you talk in the pixel font. All right, that's great. So given that this is just a single variable, if you're interested in using GameMaker variable definitions, you might consider it to be easier to create a variable definition to store this instead. Variable definitions are a handy feature of GameMaker which allow you to create simple variables that you can use and access like this in a more graphical user interface sort of way. So if I were to create a variable definition of type asset and just like drag the font from the asset browser into that little box, that'll just give us some UI where we can define these font variables here. And it might be a little more convenient than just using creation code like this. You can also define the array of text like this, but when you start defining like arrays of variables in variable definitions like this, it stops being fun and starts being kind of a huge pain real fast. So I'm not going to do that. Let's see. Now if I walk up to any old NPC, we can see that we have the exact same thing that we had before. So that's fonts. So now that we've got colors and fonts out of the way, we can move on to one of those things that I said is a lot more complicated than it sounds on the surface. And that is how you can do things like changing colors or changing fonts mid-line. That is a lot more complicated. So to do that, if you have a string of text which you want to change from one color to another or one font from another mid-line, GameMaker doesn't have any built-in way of doing that. People have been asking for a built-in way to do that in GameMaker since time immemorial, and maybe someday it will actually happen, but at the current moment, there isn't any built-in way of doing that in GameMaker, and it doesn't look like any is going to be added anytime soon. To do that yourself, you would effectively have to break up your font into different pieces, each piece using a single different font or color or whatever, and you would have to figure out how to draw each of those pieces of text in sequence. You would have to do some math to figure out how to position each of the individual text strings when you draw them. You can write your code to do that if you want, but pretty much everybody realistically will just take code that someone has already written to do that and just use it themselves. If you're just getting started in GameMaker, I would recommend not worrying about this. Once you're comfortable with your skills in GameMaker and making GameMaker do what you want it to do, then you might consider looking into something like Scribble to do this for you. But if you're just starting out, I would recommend not worrying about this. So moving on from fonts and colors, there's something I actually can't believe that I didn't do this in the original video, but by all accounts I didn't. So if you have either a long line of text or if you have a font which takes up a lot of space, let me go into the default font and make this a little bit bigger so that it takes up more space. If I were to just talk to the like refrigerator NPC or something like that, on the second line is pretty long and it spills out of this text box here. And that usually is not what you want to see. You would usually want your text to wrap so that it stays within the bounds of the text box. And automatic text wrapping is actually something that GameMaker will do for you by default. And if you want that, instead of saying draw text, there is another function which is draw text extended, which is largely the same as just the regular draw text function. But you can specify a few additional parameters. And the first one I'm just going to set to -1. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second one is going to be the width of the text, the maximum width of the text before it will wrap around and and start a new line. So the width of the text box itself is going to be, we can say box width is going to be x2 minus x1. So that's just the difference between the rightmost coordinate and the leftmost coordinate. The box height, in case you're curious, is y2 minus y1. This is something that you'll encounter in GameMaker all the time when you're trying to get the dimensions of objects. Sometimes you'll be presented with dimensions of an object in terms of like opposing corners, and sometimes you'll be presented with the dimensions of an object in terms of like the width and height, and it's useful to be aware of the relationship between those two things. Anyway, so if I were to just use the box width, the text box width of in the draw text extended function, this will work, but it won't work quite precisely the way that we like, and that's because the width of the text box is actually a little bit wider than the width of the text that we like, because our text is drawn with a little bit of padding on the inside of the text box. So if I run this now, if I go and talk to this the refrigerator NPC over here, first line's fine, it's not too long, it doesn't spill outside the bounds of the text box, but the second line, you only actually got to see it momentarily, but for a couple of frames before, while the text was scrolling out, you actually could see that there were a couple of letters outside the bounds of the text box, because draw text extended will wrap words on like space characters, so it won't ever like break up words in the middle. And because we actually want the width of the text before it wraps to be a little bit less than the width of the box, we can say var box width equals x2 minus x1 minus, we could say minus 32. Realistically, I like the padding, like the extra space, the padding between the edge of the text box and where the text actually starts and ends. I'd like that to be on all sides, like top, bottom, left, right, whatever. So I'm going to subtract 32 twice, once for the left and once for the right. This is getting to the point where we might want to define a separate variable that's like var text padding equals 32, and then we could say text x equals x1, the coordinates of the rectangle, plus text padding, y equals y1 plus text padding, and box width is going to be the difference between the left and right of the text box minus padding times 2. And this is going to give us some text box wrapping where the text can't actually flow out of this text box or flow dangerously close to the side of the text box like that. Okay? So now we have text wrapping and staying where it belongs. If I walk up to another NPC, I think you've got a longer line on the second line too. Alright, yeah, you're going to make New Jersey jokes. And I did not actually mean to close that. I meant to go and talk to the third NPC. Is your second line also a little on the long side? I think your second line is a little bit shorter, so you're not gonna wrap. So that is text wrapping. Before I end this off, I would like to circle back to the beginning where we talked about the rectangle a little bit. So as it stands, when we just draw a rectangle of a solid color, that's okay, but it is fairly basic. It's not that exciting. And it is possible to dress up the rectangle a little bit. For example, you can draw like a rectangle with a 1 pixel outline by using the draw rectangle function again with a different color. Let's say c_white. So this will be a rectangle with a black fill and a white outline. And then if you set the outline only parameter in the draw rectangle function to true, this will give us a black, like I just said, a black rectangle with a white outline around it. And that is a little bit more interesting than the solid color we had before, but it's still not that really impressive. What you might want to do instead is draw a, use an actual sprite to represent the text box, and you might do something instead like, let me go and create a sprite. And you might like to have something like this stand in for the border of your text box, more so than just a plain blank rectangle. So if I were to simply replace the draw rectangle function calls with something like a draw sprite function call, and we can take SPR, I didn't actually name it, did I? Let's call it SPR dialog box. We can say draw sprite SPR dialog box subimage 0. X can be x1, y can be y1. If I just do this, the text box that is representing the dialog box is not going to really like actually contain that text because that's pretty small. You could, of course, make this dialog box sprite bigger, however big the screen size is. That presents some obvious problems, such as if you decide that you want your screen size to be bigger or smaller, then suddenly your text box is no longer going to fit. And if you prefer to have your define the bounds of your text box like this through code, then there's not really a nice, easy way to have the dialog box just like scale up and down. You could use the draw sprite stretched function like this. And the draw sprite stretched function takes an x and a y and also a width and a height. So it's almost the same arguments as draw rectangle, which takes 2 coordinates. But we are going to go back to x, y, width, and height, like I mentioned before. Not unlike what we had before with like our text width and our text height. I'm going to actually rearrange this just a tiny bit, and I'm going to say var text width. I should have named it this to begin with because it's really more accurate to what it does. But we can say the text width is going to be box width minus text padding times 2. Use that variable instead. Anyway, we can use the actual box width and box height in the draw sprite stretch function like this. And this is going to sort of draw a text box that sort of takes up the space that we gave it, but it is going to have the side effect where it obviously just stretches the sprite. And that isn't really good looking. That will become more or less of a problem if you make your dialog box bigger or smaller, if you make your game window bigger or smaller, and the text box needs to stretch to fill it. The ways where that sort of falls apart should be fairly obvious. So it would be nice if GameMaker gave us a way of drawing sprites which allowed us to like stretch out the big empty parts in the middle, for in the case of this text box, while leaving the scaling of the corners alone. And that would, in theory, allow us to draw a text box which could be stretched, scaled, scaled up, scaled down, drawn as big or small as you want without getting any weird scaling artifacts around the corners. And as it turns out, that is exactly what something called GameMaker's 9-slice system is for. So if you've never seen this before, this is a lot of fun. So if you go into one of these sprites properties like this, and I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so that we can see more of it. And if you click on the 9-slice tab over here on the side, that's going to open up this box with some pink grid lines on it. And what this is all about is this will do what I said before. So if you stretch a sprite, normally it would stretch uniformly, and you might get some weird like effects around, for example, the corners of the sprite. But if you activate GameMaker's 9-slice system, and I'm just gonna let's leave that at that size for now. GameMaker's 9-slice system will allow you to basically slice your sprite up into 9 pieces, as the name implies. And if you define the sections of your 9-slice sprite in a certain way, you will be able to draw a sprite like this, scaled up, stretched, scaled down in any way that you like. But even if you stretch it out way long like that, the corners will be preserved, and the sides will be preserved, and you won't have any weird like stretching artifacts around the edges of your sprites. This was like a huge deal when this was first added to GameMaker, because this was one of the things, like, writing your own code to do this manually is one of those things that isn't difficult, but it is like long and boring and nobody wants to do it. So there's a whole bunch of other fun things that you can do with 9-slices, and maybe that will be a story for another video. Let me just start with this. So I should probably go and make the corner, like the corner designations of this a little bit nicer. It won't really affect how this particular sprite works, but if you have a 9-slice sprite with a little more detail in it, if you just have like your slice boundaries in kind of off in the middle of nowhere, then that can have some consequences. So in this sprite, I'm just going to have each of the guides 18 pixels from the left, top, right, and bottom. Anyway, 9-slice sprites will work automatically with draw sprite stretched, where you define a sprite where you draw a sprite with a defined x, y, width, and height. And if I run this now, and if I talk to an NPC, we can see that we're actually not doing anything, because I forgot to check the box that will actually turn this on. So No matter where your 9-slice guides are, they won't actually do anything if you don't have the checkbox that says activate 9-slice checked when you run your game. Let's try that again. There we go. So now we have a sprite which is a sprite which is being drawn in the border. It is being drawn without any weird stretching artifacts. Technically, the middle sections, like the middle, the top, bottom, left, and right, are being stretched in the way that I've set it up like this, but it's just the corners that are not. You might want to be a little bit more careful if you have some sort of repeating pattern in the middle of this 9-slice. So another advantage of this is that this sprite is 288 by 96, and that's actually quite a lot bigger than it needs to be. Let's see. If I were to go and just cut out... can I, like, snap to the grid so that I can do this easier? Let me cut out... And we can just trim the empty space, auto-trim all frames. And we can have a 96 by 96 sprite that will achieve the same effect. This can actually be even smaller to have the same effect. When I run the game now, the 9-slice sprite is not going to work properly because I need to readjust the position of the grid lines because those got moved around when I changed the size of the sprite. All right. Now it'll work the same as it did before, and all we've got is this little here 96 by 96 sprite. Again, you can make this even smaller if you'd like. You can squish this even smaller, but I'm not going to go, like, too overboard here. This is really satisfying to play around with in this, like, preview window off on the side. Okay. So that is using a 9-slice instead of drawing some rectangles. So that is a number of different ways in which you can dress this up. There is, of course, more that you can do with this. Some obvious examples might be giving different NPCs different text boxes or different font colors or things like that. You could also draw, like, the NPC speaker name on the top of the dialog box. I will leave that as an exercise to the reader. You should be able to reason through something like that fairly easily at this point. And I think I am going to end this off here. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. If you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository down in the description of the video. I believe I will be sticking this on a separate branch of the original repository, just to keep both of those projects in sort of the same place. I do like to make videos on weird stuff you can do in GameMaker, so if anything like that appeals to you, feel free to subscribe. Sometimes I make videos like this, and sometimes I make videos on weird, complicated stuff like 3D and shaders. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places. You should all go check out Wizardox and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to the Steam page can be found down below. I hope you all found that useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Squarecrow, Spy Games, Pixelated Pope, Manta Ray, GameMaker, GameArt Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, and Bokeh Dev for supporting these videos. If you want to contribute to the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.